This is my latest fantasy illustration, and in this video I'm gonna share some tips, tricks and techniques on how to create an illustration like this, applying the underpainting technique, desaturating the colors to bring a beautiful and more interesting result to your painting. Hey everyone, welcome to another Mind Sketch Studio video. For those who already know me, thanks for coming back to my channel. For those who don't know me yet, my name is Júlio César Petrini, I am an illustrator, and today I'm gonna share my painting process of my latest fantasy illustration, which is an elf and a dwarf ambushed by skeletons in a dark dungeon. I started my painting process by wetting my paper that already had my final drawing, which was made on a 300 gram hot press watercolor paper. And I like to use a big standard makeup brush to spread the water around, and the right way is to remove the excess water with your brush so you don't have any reflection. You have to see the paper texture through the water. With the paper still wet, I started applying a thin layer of burnt sienna. The goal here is to keep the background very light, because this base layer will still affect all the colors that are gonna be applied over it. When the first base layer dried, I applied a second coat of a very watery burnt sienna, just as a value study that helps to understand some darker areas and shades that will guide me on the painting process. Here are some good reasons to add an underpainting on your painting process. An underpainting is responsible to get rid of the white from the paper, which oddly enough can be really intimidating for those who wonder where to start painting. Also, the underpainting helps to desaturate the colors, creating a less saturated and more interesting result to the final painting. The underpainting is also really good for value studies before applying the final colors. I started my painting by painting the background, and this time I decided to do not use any type of mask to preserve my characters in the foreground or any other areas of the illustration. And this decision was based on the fact that I was looking for a different style for this illustration. Usually I paint with gouache and I work with a style that it's really close to the watercolor style, but this time I wanted something more like a painting itself. And since gouache is an opaque medium, I would be able to fix some of the edges and outlines from the main characters and also other areas of the illustration. After adding a couple of gray layers on the background, I started adding some darker details, such as cracks and stones. You guys can still see the underpainting through the watery layer that I applied on the background, and this is good because I didn't want to keep the walls with just one color. I would like the bricks to be in different colors, and the underpainting helps with that. To paint the skeletons, I started with very thin layers of white, and then I built up the colors with several more layers to add shades and bring in some life to their skin. I had to apply a lot of layers since the best way to work with gouache is working from thin layers to thick layers. My main goal was not adding very thick layers at the end, because I still wanted the transparency of the layers showing through the background color to desaturate the painting in the final result. I wanted the skeletons to have a sort of bluish skin tones to show that they were dead, but the transparency with the yellowish from the background would still show that they were alive. This skeleton with a sickle was inspired by a skeleton from the game Hero Quest, which is one of my favorite board games ever. Once the skeletons were almost finished, I decided to start painting the background before painting our main characters in the foreground. The painting process for the background was almost the same as the other areas. I added the first layer and then other layers over it to start building up the color. I didn't want to have the color from the underpainting really present in the background, but at the same time I didn't want to cover with a thick layer. So I started adding layer over layer to see which would be the point to stop and have a nice result. One of the things that I like the most to draw and paint are bricks and debris. It's really nice to just randomly create a shape and form and add some cracks and some other small details. You feel kind of free to do that, and there's no rule, there's no right process to do that. And the nice thing about it is that the more details you add, like cracks and debris, the coolest the final result of your illustration is gonna be at the end of the process. Time to start painting our main characters in the foreground. I started by adding some colors on the hair and skin tones from the elf, and then layer after layer I built up the colors and shades, adding more details to the skin tones and the clothes as well. Another thing that I really like to paint is chainmail. It's really nice to add all the small details and layered over layer of shades and highlights and see the chainmail comes to life. It's really interesting and I love it. The reason why this video is gonna be a bit longer than usual, it's because this painting process was longer than usual. And it took too much time because I was applying thin layers of gouache over and over. I didn't want to apply a thick layer directly on paper because once you add a thick layer, you are not able to come with a watery or a thin layer over and mix the colors the proper way. Time to start painting our last character, the dwarf. It's interesting because some of the followers from my other social media asked me if the dwarf and the elf were actually Gimli and Legolas. Actually, the answer is more complicated than that. The answer is yes and no. Firstly, I didn't think about Gimli and Legolas at the scene, but when you have a fantasy image with an elf and a dwarf fighting together, it's really hard to do not think about Legolas and Gimli. I am very much inspired by the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's universe when I create my fantasy illustrations, so I decided to say that yes, these are Legolas and Gimli fighting some skeletons in a dark dungeon. The illustration was almost complete, and then I started to wrap up some details, bringing more contrast, adding some shades in darker areas, and also adding some highlights. One thing I've learned from this illustration is that the underpainting is a really good way to desaturate your colors and make them look more beautiful at the end. You don't need necessarily to mix colors on the palette to achieve a desaturated or dull color. The first base layer will definitely affect the colors during the process, and then you can mix them together to create beautiful contrasts at the end of the process. To create some highlights on the wall, I used a ruler and a white pencil, and I think this is the best technique to do that. I wanted to create some ambience on the illustration, so I added some darker areas around the edges using airbrush and black gouache. And this created a sort of light in the middle of the illustration, emphasizing the elf and the dwarf. And this is my final illustration, which I called Legolas and Gimli ambushed in the dungeon. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and this illustration process, and I also hope you guys learned something from the tips I shared here. If you like the video, give a thumbs up, leave a comment below, or share with a friend. If you are not subscribed yet, make sure to hit the bell button to see more content like this, and stay tuned for more videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.